Hello, everyone. If you are just joining us, welcome to the Radical Exchange Annual Conference. Our next session will be Quadratic Funding in Ethereum. I'd like to welcome Pia Mancini to the virtual stage to begin our session.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's my pleasure today to introduce Vitaly to chat about quadratic funding in the Ethereum community. Funding and sustaining our commons has been a traditionally difficult problem to solve, and it might be even harder when you try to do it coordinating a decentralized community. So here to talk about that, it's my pleasure to introduce Vitaly.
Thank you, and great to be at this wonderful event in virtual form. I'm always happy to talk about many things, and kind of quadratic funding in particular has definitely been one of my kind of big interests for the last couple of years. And I guess I'll probably just put the slides on here. Just give me 1 second. Okay. Sorry about that. Downloads.
Are you still with us?
Yeah, no, I'm still here. I'm just trying to figure out exactly how to take this file and move it over some other place. Okay. Okay. Sorry, this is confusing. My phone has a folder called downloads and a folder called downloads singular, and so I need to just What? No.
Virtual conferences are not as easy as they seem.
No, it is definitely not. Okay, downloads. Okay. Copy to again.
Okay. In the meantime, I think that if there's time for questions at the end, we're going to take some questions. So make sure that you upload them where you have to upload them.
Sounds good to me. Okay, back. There it is. Yay! And I think I got it to work. Does everyone see that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I guess so. Just to start off, I kind of wanted to give a quick kind of recap of what quadratic funding is. So quadratic funding is this mechanism that was introduced by myself and Glenn in the paper on liberal radicalism a couple of years ago. And the purpose of the mechanism is basically to kind of allocate funding toward kind of public goods, right? Public goods just basically meaning any kind of project that's valuable to large groups of people, where you can't control kind of who gets to like if you create the thing, you can't control who gets to use it and who doesn't. Things like, for example, the environment, scientific research, any kind of like book, art, article, kind of work of media, in many cases is a public good. And public goods always kind of suffer from this problem that they are kind of underfunded. Like basically because the fact that you can't control kind of who has access to something and who can't means that there's no kind of personal benefit to someone from participating, actually contributing money to a public good, except for if they decide to donate, then there's only this fairly tiny incentive, because if you donate money to some public project, like you're kind of only slightly increasing the probability that that project actually will be funded, or slightly increasing the quality of that project. And so there is this kind of tragedy of the commons effect, where any single person's contributions to a public good kind of only will benefit themselves along with a whole bunch of other people. But if people only take into account the benefits of themselves, then everyone ends up contributing kind of much less than they actually would, right? And so quadratic funding is about basically kind of compensating for this tragedy of the commons effect by kind of automatically allocating a pool of subsidies based on how much people contribute, right? So quadratic funding is interesting because it's if completely neutral in a certain sense. So a lot of people have heard of quadratic voting, but one of the challenges with quadratic voting is that while you have this kind of decentralized voting procedure on any particular issue, there's still this question of like, well, who gets to figure out what's on the ballot in the first place, right? And quadratic funding actually makes even the question of what's on the ballot sort of emergent and part of the mechanism in some sense. So the way that this works is basically anyone can spin up a project, anyone can contribute money to projects, and you have this kind of subsidy pool, and the kind of the source of the subsidy pool isn't kind of specified by the mechanism. It could be a philanthropist, it could be kind of some kind of company that's overseeing some like ecosystem, it could be a government, it could be a lot of different things. And basically, the way that the subsidy pool is used is according to this formula, where you take kind of everyone's individual contributions, you take the square root of those each of those contributions, you can calculate the sum of the square roots, and then you calculate the square of the sum of the square roots. So in my little diagram on the slide here, and if the green squares are the contributions, the length of the squares are the square roots, and then and if the contributions themselves are the diagonals, but then if you take the square of the sum of the square roots, that kind of gets expanded to this big kind of yellow square, where the yellow parts are this kind of extra subsidy money. And basically from the subsidy pool, you kind of add these extra amounts, and any project that gets funded by more than one person will get subsidized to some extent, and projects that have more contributions from more people will get kind of disproportionately more subsidies. So in the liberal radicalism paper, there's a bunch of kind of mathematical logic for why this is optimal. And I also wrote a blog post on quadratic payments that's on vitalik.ca, where you can kind of find another kind of simplified kind of mathematical explanation for why this works. But the purpose of my talk today is basically that quadratic funding is not just theoretical math anymore. Quadratic funding is something that we actually kind of implemented and try to make work in practice. So just to kind of introduce the status quo before Gitcoin grants, right? So Ethereum is the world's second largest kind of blockchain or public blockchain and cryptocurrency ecosystem. And the Ethereum community, like all blockchain communities, has many underprovided public goods, right? So like online communities especially really suffer from this public goods problem because basically everything is happening online, and so kind of the tools that people need to use, the information that people need to kind of understand things better, and pretty much everything that people need within the context of the Ethereum ecosystem, basically, except for kind of Ether and the other tokens themselves, in many cases is a public good, right? Like basically, kind of offline, you have a lot of public goods, but you also have a lot of private goods, because you have physical objects, the physical objects can only be held by one person at a time, and so you can buy and sell and trade them. But online ecosystems, public goods become this kind of big and even bigger concern. The status quo is that the Ethereum Foundation is the main fund allocator, and it has about a 30 million a year budget. It uses this to support a lot of kind of research into things like cryptography, development of code, kind of Ethereum client software, certain kinds of applications, just a lot of different things that are valuable to the ecosystem. In addition to the Ethereum Foundation, there are kind of wealthy ICO projects that launched on top of Ethereum and now have some of their own money that they use to allocate funds. Whales, which is kind of a term that just means like wealthy holders of Ether, companies in the Ethereum ecosystem like Consensus. And the challenge basically is, well, can we make the funding sources more diverse and democratic, right? And the Ethereum ecosystem is one where people are already really into decentralization. People are interested in these ideas of can we cooperate without kind of centralized actors deciding everything? And so like these ideas of kind of quadratic funding and the radical exchange ideas like really appeal very naturally to the Ethereum ecosystem. So we decided to try to do it, right? So Gitcoin, even from before Gitcoin grants, it started off by doing kind of bounties for basically kind of small code development tasks in the Ethereum ecosystem. But they then kind of decided to try to expand by doing this kind of pilot, where they created this platform that's called Gitcoin Grants now, that which tries to do a kind of quadratic funding for Ethereum projects, right? So basically, anyone can kind of register, anyone can create a project. So here I have the top 10 winners for, I think it was the third round, kind of the first round where things ended up started being actually interesting. So anyone can set up a project, anyone can contribute to a project, and this kind of quadratic funding subsidy formula is used to kind of calculate basically how much donations get matched, right? So you see here, number one and number two, ETHub got about $4,700 in contributions, and Austin Griffith got about $8,600. But the matching, ETHub got 16,000 and Austin got about 15,000, right? Which basically shows that the amount of donations that ETHub and Austin got are about the same, or rather, Austin is considerably bigger, but ETHub got contributions from a wider and a more diverse group of people. And the quadratic funding formula, kind of, it doesn't just count dollars, it also counts people, and so it ended up matching that more. So far, we've had kind of 6 rounds of this kind of quadratic funding procedure. So in every round, basically, the start of the round gets announced. Everyone sets up projects, and people can contribute over a period of 2 weeks. Everyone kind of advertises their projects. Everyone contributes. And at the end of the 2 weeks, kind of the round closes, and the subsidies are calculated based on this formula, right? So Gitcoin Grants has had over $500,000 of matching funds and something like over $1 million in contributions elicited from the community, thousands of people participating, and it's been kind of steadily doing this for over a year. So it started last year, and I'm not even going to talk about round 1 and round 2 because they were fairly small. There were not that many people participating. The results weren't kind of particularly good. But round one and round two did kind of start introducing people to the mechanism. They did kind of start giving people more of an idea of like, hey, what's actually going on here? And round three is this first round that we had that actually had a very significant size, right? So in round three, the subsidy pot, I think it was $100,000, and the kind of contributions, as we've seen, were and it got something like tens of thousands of dollars of contributions, and so you actually start seeing a lot of these kind of really different and interesting projects kind of applying for contributions, right? So what did we learn from round three? So first of all, we learned this kind of boring but good result, which is that, at least in my opinion, the outcomes were broadly very reasonable, right? So people chose projects, so like Ethereum client developer teams as one example. So you see Prismatic and Lighthouse, number 3 and 5. Ethereum scaling solutions, you saw Plasma Group at number 10. Developer tools, programming languages, projects that try to just kind of publish useful information about Ethereum. Austin Griffith, Ethereum developer that makes a whole bunch of smaller things. So people chose projects that seemed to be good and important to the Ethereum ecosystem, not a lot of wasteful projects. People funded many projects that we did not even realize were important. Developer tools that make it easier to interact with specific kinds of applications. Even like Austin Griffith, for example, is someone who's been kind of doing a lot of good work that got recognized well by the community, but up until that point, probably wasn't kind of supported too much by the foundation. And I think even like for myself personally, like I did not even know Austin that well at this time. I only kind of heard the name in passing, and it like the quadratic funding round like basically did kind of call to our attention kind of the facts that Austin existed. Austin was doing all of this kind of great work for Ethereum, and that this is someone that we should be basically paying more attention to. So quadratic funding, not only did it kind of fund the boring and obvious stuff, it also actually funded the things that were not too obvious to us, but in retrospect made a lot of sense. And also the process did kind of help people basically feel more engaged in the community, right? So the process just by giving people the ability to kind of contribute to projects, have their contributions be matched, it got people thinking about what projects in the community are people doing that are valuable and that have been kind of underfunded and undersupported by us. And it created this kind of community dynamic engagement that democratic decision making is supposed to be about. So after round 3, we have round 4. So in round 4, we decided to do this kind of experiment where we split the round into 2 categories, where one round is technology projects and the other round is media projects. And we renamed media to community now because the word media didn't kind of give quite the emphasis that we wanted to give. But basically, tech is pretty obvious. It's tech, research, software, anything like that. And media is projects that try to inform people about Ethereum and provide information of different kinds, newsletters, podcasts, YouTube kind of videos, a whole bunch of different things. So we wanted to just kind of run quadratic funding rounds for these 2 categories separately and kind of see what happens, and especially kind of create a signal that Gitcoin grants isn't just for tech, and that these also very valuable media projects, and it will create an entire section for them and see what happens inside of that section. So what did we learn in round 4? So round 4 is probably the first round where things got kind of really interesting in a spicy way. So on the tech side, And it was kind of pretty boring in a good way, right? On the tech side, we just saw continued contributions to these kind of uncontroversially valuable projects. But on the media side, really interesting things started to happen, right? So basically, one of the top recipients on the media side, you can see number 2, anti-prosynthesis, received $11,000 in quadratic funding matching. And what this account is it's literally just someone who said, hey, I'm a Twitter account. I've been tweeting Ethereum things for a couple of years. Donate money to support my tweeting. And at the time, like, no one realized that, like, hey, you can earn $10,000 just for tweeting. And this person did, right? And a lot of people in the community made these kind of independent decisions to support this person's tweets. And they found his kind of social media activity very important and valuable in terms of getting the Ethereum message out there in the particular way that he does. But at the same time, other people were upset at this, right? There were a lot of other people that were saying things like, this team worked kind of really hard and made put a lot of kind of serious effort into making a newsletter or making some project that involves like really complicated cryptographic code involving zero knowledge proofs or something else. And here someone raised even more money than they did by tweeting. So basically, in here you can see kind of on the right some examples of this kind of Twitter influencer. And so some just information about Ethereum, some things of the form, they're kind of just Ethereum is great, rah, rah, rah. So a lot of kind of fairly mixed content, right? So a lot of people in favor of him, kind of a lot of people also opposed to him getting such a large share of the media pool. So there were 2 kind of major criticisms here, right? So one of them is just that basically kind of, does someone really deserve $10,000 for just tweeting? So one response to this is that if you see the kind of the sheer volume of the tweets that he made, and he clearly spent a lot of time on the tweets and worked hard, has been doing it for years, and a lot of people did actually kind of interpret the quadratic funding rounds as not just being kind of rewards for work done in the last 2 months since the previous rounds, but also as compensation for years of work that has been uncompensated since at least 2018. And the second response is just as kind of the free market argument, right? Well, hey, a bunch of people found the tweets valuable enough that they actually donated money themselves. So who are you to say that all these people are wrong when you didn't kind of put your money where your mouth is yourself? And criticism 2 is interesting, right? So the criticism 2 is that these tweets might help in some ways, but they also might hurt in other ways, right? So if you kind of zoom in and look at some of these, some of them say things like, Ethereum is unstoppable, or so yes, Bitcoin was a massive breakthrough, but we can only hope that it won't be the endpoint. And so there are people that kind of criticize some of the things that this account says as kind of being fairly aggressive in certain respects. And so basically, there was this kind of concern, are there kind of negative externalities that are here? And quadratic funding by itself doesn't take into account negative externalities, right? Quadratic funding is all about taking into account positive externalities. And in my blog post, kind of originally talking about this round, I kind of compared this to a very common theory of why markets are inefficient, which is basically that markets are especially inefficient when shorting is hard, right? So when you have an ability to express a positive opinion on a stock, but not a negative opinion on a stock, then the price of a stock does not end up reflecting the average opinion of the stock price. It ends up reflecting the most optimistic opinions of the kind of the future stock price and the future performance of that stock. And so the question is, well, might the same thing be happening here? So some people accused this account of like basically creating these negative externalities. Other people thought that the account was great, and there's other people who probably thought that maybe that account deserved, $4,000 but not $10,000. And so to kind of solve both those concerns, and that, are there kind of negative externalities that are being not taken into account, and how do we let people express the idea that a project has kind of too much funding? And the anti-prosynthesis wasn't the only kind of accounts that or kind of in round 4 that led to these kinds of issues, but it was kind of one of the more obvious ones that kind of stood out to a lot of people. And so we attempt to kind of counteract this with a negative contribution mechanic, right? So in quadratic funding, you basically take kind of the square root of everyone's contributions, you add up these square roots, and if you remember kind of learning math, you'll remember that every number actually has 2 square roots. It has a positive square root and a negative square root. So the question is, well, what happens if you let people choose to have their contribution represent a negative square root instead of the positive square root, right? So basically, if you take the analogy between quadratic funding and quadratic voting, instead of just being able to vote for a project, you can now also vote against the project. And so we attempt to introduce this mechanic where you can make a contribution, have it count negatively, and see what happens. So I'll get what does happen, and we'll see, and I'll get to this a bit after. One third really interesting thing that we discovered in round 4, right, is that first, the quadratic funding round is kind of called an Ethereum quadratic funding round, and it's theoretically a quadratic funding round kind of for the Ethereum ecosystem, but nothing in the quadratic funding rules actually privileges Ethereum projects over other projects, right? And even in the original quadratic funding paper, it was described as a kind of formal rules for a society neutral among communities, right? The quadratic funding rules really are neutral. Anyone can spin up a project, anyone can donate, all of the donation projects that get multiple donations get subsidized. And so what happens when a project outside of the Ethereum ecosystem kind of starts participating? And here we actually saw someone basically saying, hey, I'm a Twitter influencer too, except I'm a Twitter influencer for Ethereum Classic. And Ethereum Classic is this kind of, and sometimes you consider this kind of little brother to Ethereum. It's this blockchain that sort of forked off from the main Ethereum chain when the DAO fork, this kind of controversial event in Ethereum history, happened about 4 years ago. So Yazinator here is he is someone who loves Ethereum Classic and is a Twitter influencer for Ethereum Classic, and he started accepting contributions. In this case, he only got, I think it was 6 contributions, but he still got $38 of matching funding from a matching pool that was theoretically intended to be an Ethereum matching pool. And so the question that this raises is basically, do we need centralized kind of filtering to basically determine what is an Ethereum project and what isn't? Might this be another use case of kind of negative contributions, where if this is supposed to be for the Ethereum community, then as long as the quadratic funding is kind of mostly done by the Ethereum community, then could the Ethereum community just kind of basically just provide negative votes against any project that it considers to be sort of off topic? Would you want centralized moderation of some kind? Would you want some other kind of DAO, some other distributed process for determining what is a real Ethereum project? Whatever this procedure is, could that procedure be abused? So we don't really have good answers for this yet. And I think so far, there's definitely been some centralized curation going on, especially in terms of figuring out like what goes in the media section, what goes in the tech section. So do we claim to have solutions better than centralized curation? Probably not yet. But no, this is one of those kind of challenges on the frontier of the mechanism, right? Like this kind of mismatch between the universality of quadratic funding in theory versus the fact that kind of the existing funding sources for matching funds do want to support specific communities. So now we have round 5. So round 5 kept the tech and media format. Round 5 did introduce negative contributions, but we saw a negative result, right? So negative contributions ended up being used very little. So there's maybe like it was about 10 of them versus like thousands of positive contributions or something like that. And the few times it did, people were very upset, right? So one piece of kind of feedback that we got, just kind of summarizing a lot of people's opinions into one sentence, is like kind of being downvoted makes me feel terrible. Gitcoin grants is supposed to be about a spirit of positivity, giving people the ability to basically rip money out of each other's pockets, kind of really kind of ruins that mechanic. And so it ended up not being very effective, right? And so what do we learn from this, right? So one takeaway might be like, well, don't do this negative contribution thing. But the reality is that there is still an unsolved problem here, right? So the problem is that, theoretically, there are projects that have negative externalities, and there are projects that are really overrated by a small community. And there's no good way of kind of dealing with this, right? So in this particular case, like it seems like there weren't actually that many people that were kind of upset with anti-prosynthesis enough to try to take money away from him. So, I guess, he can rest easy and knowing that he is not, in fact, kind of widely condemned by the Ethereum community as a bearer of negative externalities, and that there's kind of people are mostly appreciative of his work, or you could kind of conclude that people are just very wary of giving negative kind of contributions in general. And there's also the question of, well, maybe negative contributions should exist, but they shouldn't kind of be visible. So you shouldn't be able to see that you got a negative contributions, that you should just see the total at the end. But regardless of kind of which path you end up taking, like I do think that quadratic funding is going to have some kind of mechanism for dealing with kind of projects that have negative effects, right? Like, and like what kinds of trolls there exist on the internet, and people who kind of believe and promote also kind of all sorts of positions that kind of people making a quadratic providing a kind of quadratic funding would kind of really not wants to promote. And dealing with kind of those kinds of projects that have these kinds of mixed positive and negative or even negative effects is something that quadratic funding at present isn't really doing a good job of. And so, we have to kind of keep iterating on this and figure out something better. Stability of income, a concern in round 5. So project revenue often kind of goes up and down by a factor of 2 or 4 or more between rounds. And if we want quadratic funding to be a mechanism that actually funds people's livelihoods, then we need kind of contributions to be more stable. And in round 6, we did some kind of innovations to try to address that. In round 5, we also started to see some kind of collusion and some fake accounts to try to basically send a bunch of contributions from different fake accounts to try to get more, kind of fraudulently get more matching funding. So in round 6, so we focused on both of those problems. So we added a kind of add to cart interface, make it easy to kind of make a lot of contributions. We added a functionality that just says, repeat the contributions you made in the last round. We added a mechanism where 1/3 of the contributions in the last round automatically kind of become calculated as part of the matching pool. And we added kind of optional phone number verification for higher matching to as a kind of stronger anti-Sybil mechanism than the thing that we had before, which was GitHub accounts. So we added those things, and unfortunately, round 6 is still in progress. But general conclusions, right? So, I think the first conclusion is that we had is that kind of in broad strokes, quadratic funding works. So quadratic funding actually was successfully able to fund choose interesting projects to fund and choose projects that deserves to get funded. It's did kind of a lot of well, it generated a lot of community engagement. Also, if you're going to do quadratic funding yourself, don't be discouraged if round one goes poorly. Quadratic funding gets better over time, and so it often takes at least until round 3 or 4 before people kind of really get into the groove of kind of how to participate. Not just the economics, but also the social properties of a mechanism are important, right? How does the mechanism make people feel? Kind of what kind of community dynamics does the mechanism create? Does the mechanism help people feel more engaged? Also, quadratic funding is not just valuable as a direct funding allocator, it's also valuable as a signal, right? If a project got $10,000 of matching on Gitcoin grants, that also is a signal that shows that, hey, this is actually a project that lots of people in the community find valuable. And that information is useful in a lot of ways, and it's helps to kind of inform the Ethereum Foundation's own funding priorities to a certain extent. It's helped kind of inform our opinions of just what are things that people feel are really important. So quadratic funding isn't just about kind of allocating money to projects in the here and now. It also is about all of these other things. So there's still kind of a fairly big kind of frontier to explore here. There's still a lot of kind of tweaks to the mechanism that you can make, and also kind of the psychology and the sociology around the mechanism is something that's really worth analyzing. Like there's a lot of kind of very counterintuitive psychology that happens around, and what happens if you kind of give people money for doing particular things, and if you give people money that's kind of comes as a result of a quadratic funding reward, does that end up kind of feeling different to getting a grant from some kind of centralized organization? So there's still a lot of those kinds of issues that's also worth kind of learning and trying to understand better as well. So we hope to see quadratic funding get deployed in more and a larger scale context. And I think the Ethereum ecosystem was this interesting test bed because the Ethereum community is this community that's both really interested in quadratic funding, and also it is large enough that it has a kind of internal disagreements, internal tribal dynamics to some extent, kind of actual kind of internal stresses that make it kind of that create kind of real world scale challenges to deploying something like this. And so, we hope that quadratic funding can continue to be used not just in Ethereum, but also in other places as well.
Thank you. That is fascinating. I'm wondering, and there's some questions here also from the folks watching this, but what other public goods do you think quadratic funding is it's a good mechanism to fund? Do you think that we can, citizens can kind of decide how to allocate part of their taxes using a quadratic funding mechanism? What public goods do you think can be funding by something like this? And what public goods do you think that maybe just cannot be funded by quadratic funding?
So one kind of very natural target in a kind of more mainstream political context would be local news media. So like in general, kind of journalism and media is something that like it's one of those really challenging things kind of institutionally, because both the market and the government ways of funding media are just terrible in different ways, right? Like the market kind of just people just pay money approach is terrible because it is a public good, it is going to get underfunded, and it creates these kind of really terrible incentives to kind of optimize for clicks and all of these other things. And I mean, media being government funded is obviously kind of terrible for reasons that are kind of fairly obvious as well. And so quadratic funding allows you to potentially fund kind of journalism in ways that both get around the tragedy of the commons without also creating this kind of centralized authority that has kind of like basically a huge amount of power over like what things people end up hearing. So that's one very natural target. Another target, this was kind of suggested to me in the context of a conversation I had with kind of Palladium people a couple of days back, is that some European countries, they have kind of this concept of either a church tax or some kind of tax that has a kind of very limited like tax choice. So I know like Italy has this kind of auto per mille as the kind of the original name for it. It's kind of 8 per thousand of year income, where you have a kind of this very limited amount of choice in like you can send it to either a church or some kind of secular organization. So there are these kind of European countries that have a tradition of like basically saying there's some portion of your a small of your taxes where you can choose kind of within bounds basically who the recipient is. And so quadratic funding could potentially be a kind of interesting alternative to those kinds of schemes. So like basically instead of being a kind of choice between 3 organizations, it could be a kind of funding going to a quadratic matching pool. And then at that point, it's kind of a national scale thing. And so it would be, people could use it for potentially everything. Also, other kind of ecosystem, like video game ecosystems might be one kind of potential kind of adopter of quadratic funding. So it really could be pretty much everything. But I mean, the one things that don't really make sense, I would say, are what I call a kind of entrepreneurial public goods. So public goods where they are public, but and they are good, but people don't kind of recognize that they're important immediately. So kind of basically the public good equivalent of venture capital, right? So like in the startup world, you know, you have venture capital that's theoretically for kind of identifying startups, creating private goods that are not highly valued now, but will be highly valued 10 years from now. And quadratic funding by itself is not like it doesn't really kind of reward predictive power in the way that venture capital does. And so it's not going to be good at like identifying things that people are going to consider to be really valuable in 2040. And so like the question of like how to actually kind of provide those kinds of things is something that we still don't really have good mechanisms for. You know, could you combine quadratic funding in prediction markets? Would you have to do something else? Still a lot of open area to explore.
Yeah, that's fascinating. In my experience with like supporting and sustaining open source ecosystems, one of the things that crowdfunding that I've seen with crowdfunding sustainability of open source projects is like it can turn into a little bit of a popularity contest, right? And so a lot of like core plumbing infrastructure that's boring and it's not as appealing normally gets kind of left on the side or has less crowdfunding that the most kind of hot, popular, kind of latest, whatever framework. So I think that I am particularly interested in sort of not only the negative kind of voting, but also if you are thinking about how to compensate for projects that are core or base, but are maybe less popular because they're less, popular. Famous.
Yeah, no, I think that's kind of a very good point as well. And I think there's two kind of answers to this. One answer is kind of within quadratic funding, right? Like in a kind of private goods economy, when you have like a lot of different tasks that kind of have to be bundled together and you don't want people to kind of pay for the tasks individually, generally what people do is they form a company, right? And customers pay money to the company and the company hires employees and the company has some kind of internal governance to basically figure out like what are the kind of the things that need to be done and like how much to compensate people for it. And so like this idea that you can have kind of companies that people can form their own units that consisting of multiple people, and that it's these kind of packages that participate in the wider mechanism, and so you kind of bundle together things that would not get kind of compensated by themselves. I think is kind of something that can be moved into a kind of quadratic funding context as well, right? And it already has been. So, for example, in the Gitcoin rounds, one of the recipients that you saw even in round 3 was these Ethereum client developer teams. So there was a Prismatic and Lighthouse and a couple of others. And those are companies, right? Those are collections of people. They have developers, they hire janitors, they hire people who do all sorts of things, right? So if you kind of abstract things out and say, like basically kind of bundle together the kind of unsexy but necessary things with kind of sexier things, then potentially can get around it within quadratic funding. So that's one answer. Another answer is that you can say that quadratic funding is definitely not a kind of master mechanism that's going to solve every problem. And in general, any mechanism for funding public goods is going to leave a lot of things underfunded or unfunded. And you have quadratic funding, and then we have kind of technocratic funding by the Ethereum Foundation, and then we have a whole bunch of different individual kind of contributions. And then you have people just working for free and getting recognition by the community for it. So you do have a lot of these different mechanisms that can partially fund public goods, but that do kind of each individually kind of leave a lot of holes. And so the idea is that maybe we don't want to have one mechanism that handles everything. Maybe we do just want to have these kind of overlapping tech mechanisms that have different strengths and weaknesses so they can compensate for each other.
Yeah. I want to make sure I touch upon this because there's a couple of questions on this area, and also I'm interested particularly on this. Quadratic funding is sitting at kind of the intersection of voting and markets, right? Or it's like a combination, if you want, of both. And it places like most of the power on individual community signaling, right? A lot of people signaling support for a project gets more funding than, just someone putting more money on a project. So at the same time, this mechanism, while it corrects for a lot of the problems that we have in funding our commons, it also puts a prime on humanity fraud, right? Which is something that I think you touched upon. So voting obviously requires proof of identity that is very easily solved in centralized communities or centralization models. Like, how important is for you proof of humanity for funding public goods in decentralized communities? What have you been seeing in the space that is interesting? What's your vision for how should we be thinking about formalizing humans, essentially?
Yeah, no, a very good question. And I think we definitely have had kind of attempts at creating decentralized unique human systems. So Bright ID is one of the projects that's doing this in the Ethereum ecosystem. There's a few others as well. There's Pope, the proof of attendance protocol. So we do have people that are trying to solve this problem that are taking a few different approaches. And then obviously right now, Gitcoin Grants is taking this kind of relatively centralized route. My general kind of instinct is still that kind of quadratic, like the identity part of quadratic funding is still is a reason why I expect quadratic funding to, at least in the short and medium term, continue to kind of work better in smaller communities than as some kind of global thing. Like basically, the more global you go, the more the easier identity fraud potentially becomes, and the harder it is to police. And like if you go into like extremely kind of big scales, like there does come a point at which it does just start becoming really hard to police, right? Like even government issued identities are something that is definitely something that people can defraud, people can sell. You definitely can like just go up to kind of poor people and say, I'll give you $1,000 if you just give me your passport and pretend I stole it from you. And if you start creating a kind of monetary incentive on doing all of those things, then this sort of stuff will happen. So my general instinct is basically that like it's good that it's being tried in smaller ecosystems where it is easier to kind of police for these kinds of issues, and we'll just kind of keep scaling up, and we'll just keep kind of dealing with the issues as they come over time.
I have to say, Vitalik, that it's very inspiring to see how the community is protecting itself here, in the sense that always when you innovate, when you propose new governance mechanisms or systems, like everyone expects the new thing to completely replace whatever was there and to work well. And that's so unfair on innovation, because it can stifle innovation, right? Because it's never going to be perfect and it's never going to replace everything. And we need to learn through experience. So I think, yeah, that's a very inspiring approach that I think you all are taking. On that note, I think our time is up. We are, so thank you for your presentation. And
thank you.
That's that.